Hey everybody, this is Dr. Maples. Welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to finish up our series on the West Virginia Mine Wars by talking about the Battle of Blair Mountain. Now, the Battle of Blair Mountain represents the largest armed insurrection on U.S. soil since the Civil War, and it also presents us a very rare case of American citizens being bombed via airplanes on U.S. soil. Now, along the way, we're going to talk about the rise in power of Don Chafin, who represents the opposition to the miners at the Battle of Blair Mountain. We'll also look at the long-term ramifications of this event and even the battle that continues for the battlefield site today. We got a lot to talk about. Let's get started. I think in all of my videos on the West Virginia Mine Wars, I've hinted at the idea of power. Power is the ability to force other people to do things they maybe don't want to do. We have to understand that in the coal fields because it's an important part of how the coal camps operated. It's an important part of how workers were forced to do a very dangerous job at increasingly lowered wages and so forth. We have to understand that, but it's a really big idea, right? I think the easiest way to approach that is a guy by the name of Don Chafin. Don represents the ability to have almost absolute power over an entire rural county, in this case, Logan County. And Don would also form the resistance against the United Mine Workers at the Battle of Blair Mountain. Don Chafin is born in Kermit, West Virginia. If you look on the map, Kermit is on the Tug Fork, place that'll be very familiar from our conversation about the battle for the Tug Fork in a previous lecture. Also, it's right across in the state of Kentucky, for those interested. And it's in, ready for this, Mingo County. Now, Mingo County, a very popular, well-known place at this point in our lectures. We know Mingo from the May 1 massacre. We also know it from the Red Jacket strikes. And we know also that Mingo was very pro-union overall, whether that was through folks like Sid Hatfield or just the popularity of the UMWA in this region. Now, as the United Mine Workers tried to work through the Tug Fork Valley overall and to unionize this entire area, Mingo was an important part of that. Don Chafin was born in Mingo, but actually very early in his life, he moves to almost a polar opposite that's, roughly 40, 50 minutes away, and that's Logan County. Now, Logan County had a reputation of being very anti-union and very pro-coal operators. And Don's also born into power in some ways. His dad is sheriff of Logan County, which means that he has a very important role in supporting the coal operators to make sure that the area isn't unionized. Don learns. He gains a lot of power really quickly, too. Age 21, he's already serving as the county assessor. Now, the county assessor position is really important because it has all sorts of tax implications that can impact the coal operators. This puts him in a situation that he can be very supportive of their interests if they will also, in turn, be supportive of his interests. In fact, there's some conversations here that he may have been getting some kickbacks from coal operators. Likewise, he was seeing to his own best interests. He ends up rising to county clerk, another important, powerful position in the county, and also serves 2 terms as sheriff. Throughout, he's creating a lot of power for himself and a lot of contacts. He also does something, I imagine from everyone's perspective, that's almost unbelievable. He has enough power and resources to actually push the Baldwin-Felts Detective Agency out of Logan County. This was something that the UMWA could only dream of achieving, and yet Don Chafin was able to do that. He actually replaces the Baldwin-Felts Detective Agency with his own constables and charges them with surveying this area, patrolling it, making sure that the coal operation isn't interrupted, and so forth. That's huge. On top of that too, Don was thinking about the bigger end of his power over time. He was thinking about how he kept it, One of the things that he was kind of known for was getting his fingers into a lot of pies in the region. That included teachers who would be offered positions or not offered positions in the area, ministers being allowed to have church parishes, and so forth. He really understood that to protect this power, he had to insulate it from the bottom up. And it's a textbook example of it. He also created a lot of resources. As I mentioned, it may have been kickbacks from the coal company. It also may have been from paying his constables well and getting a kickback from them. But we do know that in a testimony, he mentioned that even though he was making $3,500 a year, he had a wealth of $350,000. So we know something was happening because that was unheard of wealth in the 1920s. But not for the Mountain Czar. This guy had so much power that he truly was controlling Logan County. And he ends up being the opposition for the Battle at Blair Mountain against the UMWA. All right, so let's set the table for the Battle of Blair Mountain. First off, Don Chafin in the background has been building this anti-union power structure in Logan County. Second, we know that the UMWA at this point has declared war on the Tug Fork coalfields. They have said, we are going to come in, we're going to unionize this entire thing. And they have this powerful structure in Mingo, but Logan, not too far away, is going to be a huge, huge issue. So, August 1919, they decide they're going to take down Logan. They're going to take on Don Chafin. And if they could win this, it's huge. If they could disrupt the power structure that Don Chafin has created, first off, it's going to be beneficial to them in the long run. But second, it's going to show that they could take on the Mountain Czar and beat him at his own game. That's going to be a big win. September 1st, we see 5,000 unionized coal miners making their march, heading out of Mingo and heading over to Logan. And what happens? The state government gets involved, as has happened in the past, right? We see that Governor Cornell, who's the governor of West Virginia, shows up and intercepts the coal miners. And he says, hey, if y'all have complaints, tell them to me. Let me handle this politically. We don't need this to turn into a bloodshed. We don't need a war. We need to stop this before it happens. It doesn't really seem to impact the miners. In fact, they keep the march going on until they hear the news. Yeah, on September 6th, news starts to leak that basically the federal troops, first off, are getting involved. It's a big thing. And second, treason charges are going to be brought up against anyone who continues with this strike. Now, these two things are big. We have to remember we're not too far out of World War I. Probably most of the people who were involved with this would have had military training and probably served as a soldier in World War I. And this was just a really big time for treason to be just thrown around like that. But also the idea of fighting against federal troops, fighting against your own people, that's pretty scary in that situation. In fact, we see that this really starts to change things. By September 16th, we also see the complaints starting to come in as that strike just basically falls apart and people go home. And this is where Governor Cornell does something really interesting. To hear and collect the miners' complaints, he goes back in time and brings forth a name that we may have forgotten about, and that's Major Tom Davis. Do you recognize that name? You might. You might remember he was involved in Paint and Cabin Creek. In fact, he oversaw the martial law declarations way back then, and here he's appearing less than a decade later to now be involved in the same process of hearing these complaints and controlling the situation. The thing is all those complaints that the miners, the union, all the organizations end up making to Tom Davis, they just kind of go into thin air. Nothing really happens with them. Now, this is back in 1919, but it kind of sets what's going to happen next. I have to imagine union operators, Logan County folks, Don Chafin, the state of West Virginia as a whole had to know that they were sitting on a powder keg in 1921. At this point, we see Major Tom Davis has been brought back yet again to serve as someone overseeing martial law in the Tug Fork coalfields. We see that the UMWA is making good on its claims that they're going to unionize this entire area. We see the actual battle for the Tug from May 12th through May 15th, where people are fighting against the coal operators. We see the threat of federal troops coming out again. It's bad. And these all set the stage for later that year, in August, for the Battle of Blair Mountain. All right, folks, we're finally there, the Battle for Blair Mountain. We're going to start on August 7th, 1921. A couple of familiar names pop back up from the Paint and Cabin Creek strikes. It's Frank Keeney and Fred Mooney. Frank is now serving as the president of the District 17 Union, and also Fred Mooney was serving, I recall, as his secretary-treasurer. They're in the state capital of West Virginia, it's Charleston, and they are now calling for miners to assemble and invade Logan County. They call up 5,000 miners, and they're at this large, famous protest that really shows how violent things were going to be. Now, there's a really great quote from Frank that's in, actually, Bloodletting in Appalachia, Howard Lee's books. Howard Lee was at this event, so he got to hear it firsthand. And this quote, we have to understand in the context that martial law hadn't been lifted at this point, and so the miners were basically saying, we have to do something about this. And so Frank, standing before all these unionized miners who had come up, he says, therefore, you have no recourse except to fight. The only way you can get your rights is with a high-powered rifle, and the man who does not have this equipment is not a good Union man. Lee notes that he directed the miners to return to their homes and get ready. Now, there's another really famous voice that was at this Union event, and that was Mother Jones. Mother Jones, such an important part not only of the Paint and Cabin Creek strikes, but also unionizing this entire region and a figurehead in labor history. At this point, she was 91 years old, so I imagine it was a little difficult for her to do all these things, and yet she still pushed through. She got up and did this amazing speech at this Union event. In fact, I'll read the quote from the Lee book. It's, I don't think I can say that on YouTube. Anyway, suffice to say, it was a classic Mother Jones speech. History isn't without its peculiar moments, and we see one in the lead up to the Battle for Blair Mountain. Mother Jones loses her nerve at this point. Frank Keeney points out that in her old age, she'd lost a lot of her fight. And at this point, she becomes very fixated on concerns that Union leadership are going to be charged with treason if this march on Logan continues. So she intercepts the miners and basically lies to them. She says that she has a telegram from President Harding, the U.S. president, and says, hey, you've got to put down your guns or there's going to be treason charges, but if you'll just lay down your weapons and go home, everything's going to be fine. People call her out on this. You know, Frank Keeney's like, hey, show me the telegram. And, well, she says something that, again, I can't say on YouTube, but she tells him, no, thank you. And in fact, everyone kind of realizes at some point that this ruse is exactly that, and it falls flat. What ends up happening is the miners begin to organize. August 20th, we see the miners assembling on Lenz Creek along the Kanawha River in Kanawha County. And they're ready. They're going to make the march on Logan. And this time, nothing's going to stop them. August 24th, 1921, we see roughly 10,000 Union miners have organized on Lenz Creek along the Kanawha River, and they're ready to march to Logan. They've got 4 simple goals. First off, they're going to find Don Chafin, and they're going to hang him. Second, they're going to overthrow the martial law that's in place. Third, they're going to liberate all the strikers that are being held in jail in Logan. And on top of that, they're going to unionize all the miners in Logan and in Mingo County. Simple, straight, to the point. This is where West Virginia government yet again gets involved. In fact, this is where the new governor, Governor Morgan, and also one of his associates, General Bandholz, actually arranged to meet with Keeney, the leader of this unionized march, and says, hey, first off, those treason charges Mother Jones talked about, they're real. They're going to happen. You guys are going to have to put down your guns. You're going to have to go home. Otherwise, we're going to get federal troops involved, and we're going to do the treason charges. This is actually where Keeney says, hey, the march has got to end. We can't do this. The treason charges are legit. Everybody's got to go home. In fact, this is where the entire state of West Virginia thinks that everything's done. General Bandholz, who had been brought into the area to oversee this and lead the federal troops if needed, thought that that was it. He actually ends up getting the train and going home, thinking the matter is closed. Don Chafin's got other ideas. Don knew he had power. He was probably overconfident in it. In fact, at this point, he pretty much felt that he was untouchable, something that would be his undoing with time. But at this point, he wanted to show what kind of power he had. He sends a detachment of his soldiers alongside the state police into Union territory to pick a fight. They're sent under warrants to arrest strike leaders and strikers. What ends up happening is a skirmish that kills 2 miners and wounds 3 of Chafin's men. Now, the state police, who were along for the ride on this, did say that it was a case of self-defense, that the Chafin's men had to fire back at the miners who had ambushed them. And of course, the UMWA sees this from the opposing point of view. And we'll probably never 100% know exactly what happened that day. What we do know is we see the leaders for the armed march leaving. We see Keeney and Mooney, under a threat of treason, leaving town. This causes a change in leadership and puts everything on a predestined path to conflict. So, with Keeney and Mooney stepping aside because of their Union leadership positions and over those concerns for treason charges, it leads a huge leadership vacuum with the miners' side. This is where Bill Blizzard steps up. You'll recognize Bill's name, too. He's from the Paint and Cabin Creek strikes. That's right, just like Keeney and Mooney and several other people. Now, this is exciting because Bill becomes the de facto general for the miners, and he leads them through the Battle of Blair Mountain. And it's interesting because they effectively become an army. We have to remember the context. First off, World War I had just happened, so you have to understand a lot of these miners would have also been recent soldiers. They would have experience with rifles, they would have experience with military movements like pensioner movements. They would have been very familiar with, too, just the procedures of how the military would move through a place like this. So it wasn't just a bunch of people with guns. This was a minor army. There's also a couple of things that sort of show this in their behaviors over the next couple of days. First off, we begin to see the miners, as they move towards Logan, taking over highways and monitoring them to kind of prevent people from coming in and out and to watch for any of Don Chafin's men moving through the area. We also see the use of military passwords. Timingo would have been a phrase used to yell to other people as you moved across an area to let them know that you were friendlies. And perhaps the most famous symbol of this entire conflict is the red bandana, which kind of appears as a de facto uniform. Miners began tying red bandanas either around their necks or around their arms to signify that they are part of the miner army. In fact, we sometimes hear the term redneck army coming from, again, this particular moment. It's not to say that's the only origin of the word redneck as well, but this is one of those historical ones that we point to. We also see some cool things happening. They commandeer trains because remember, trains would have been your fastest route of transportation getting through this area. And the march to Logan was, no short piece of territory when you're dealing with West Virginia terrain. They also forced some doctors and nurses into service, which is kind of an interesting military tactic as well, because they knew that there would be wounded. And so they needed to have people who could take care of those injuries. So they forced these people to do that. I'd love to see more research done on that particular aspect of it and see what we can uncover. Now, within 36 hours, we see this redneck miner army moving towards Logan, and it puts them in position that their only barrier at this point ends up being Blair Mountain, which they're going to have to cross to go into the heart of Logan. So on the other side of the battlefield is Don Chafin and his militia. And I have to stress again, this is not a ragtag bunch of people with guns. This is like a small army. We can also see Don's power over the region in the way that this army was constructed. For example, he freed anyone who was in Logan County jails to basically take up a gun and fight for his side in return for a reduced or freed sentence. We don't know how many people took him up on this offer, but what we do know is that there were cases of people who refused to fight who were beaten and even murdered. This also included former miners who were union workers and had been arrested at some point and were in his custody. We also see Don using his power to send out a very wide call for support. Anyone who is anti-union and wants to be part of breaking this union's back, they can come to Logan and fight for Don. This ends up attracting a lot of Baldwin Felts agents. This attracts former soldiers. We even see deputies coming in to fight. This attracts roughly around 3,000 people in all, with including the soldiers that he already had working for him. Now, they end up building about 15 miles of reinforcements in the Blair Mountain area. Why Blair Mountain? Well, it was actually a really obvious obstacle. We have to remember that Bill would have been marching his troops south from the Charleston-Lenz Creek area, and so Blair was a logical spot that they were going to have to come to. As such, that 15 miles of fortifications really could be a deal breaker. This would have been trenches, all sorts of sort of wooden things to kind of, create barricades and defenses and stuff like that, as well as creating machine gun positions on the mountain. In fact, those machine guns, they're kind of huge. We see that 150 state police had joined Don Chafin's army to sort of support the state's interest there, and they brought with them state hardware, which included machine guns. As such, we have a very bloody fight about to happen. We have Bill Blizzard's Union strikers who are not well armed necessarily. They have skill, but they have numbers, possibly even as high as 10,000. We don't really know the exact numbers on their side. It's probably less than that would be my guess, probably more like 5,000, but we'll leave that for another day. On the other side, we have Don Chafin, who is entrenched in the mountain, has great resources, and even has a smaller army, but has the guns that can outshoot a lot of people. Things are going to get bad. There's going to be bloodletting in Appalachia. September 1st, Bill Blizzard begins sending Union miners up Blair Mountain to fight Don Chafin. His first detachment of 70 miners is led by John Wilburn. And John is a really interesting case that stuck with me when I was reading about all this history as an undergrad student. John is a mountain minister. He's a part-time miner. He's someone with deep, deep ties to Appalachia. And there's a great quote out there somewhere where he says it was time for him to lay down his Bible and to pick up his rifle because he wanted to fight against the social issues of his time. That's something that's really stuck with me over the years. John's detachment also sees the first losses of this battle. They begin a skirmish with mine guards from Don Chafin's side. 3 of the mine guards are killed, specifically deputies, including Deputy John Gore. We'll talk about him in a moment. And the miners also lose one of their own, Eli Kemp. Now, in this situation, we see prisoners taken, and we have to remember this is a military context. These are former soldiers doing what they have been trained to do. As such, we see the prisoners being beaten. In fact, John Gore's son was one of the prisoners who was taken, and he was taunted not only about his father's death, but just fiercely beaten to try and get information about the different positions further up the mountain. Prisoners would eventually be let go at the end of the battle, just as a side note. For the rest of the day, the fighting continues. Bullets are flying across the mountain. There's nowhere safe, and the 2 sides are feeling each other out. Day 2, the battle continues, and I often call this the Day of the Plains because of a very historic event that occurs on Day 2 of the Battle of Blair Mountain. Now, just as some background, you have to understand the federal government has actually already begun sending in troops. In fact, they have sent a detachment of bombers and fighters into the area under Brigadier General Billy Mitchell and the Air Service. Now, you may recognize Billy Mitchell's name. Billy's actually the founder of the Air Force, and the Air Service, which I believe was linked through the Army at the time, is sort of the early version of the Air Force. At this point, he really wanted to prove the superiority of the Air Service and show that it was a valuable part of keeping the peace. I think the evidence implies that he was ready to bomb and shoot anyone who was going to be a problem in this area to show that the Air Service was a valuable part of defending the United States. Now, General Bandholtz, who was kind of overseeing all of this for the federal government, and you'll remember him earlier from conversations about the treason charges with Keeney and Mooney, he actually disarms everything. He requires that all the guns and bombs be stripped away from these aircraft. And throughout the Battle of Blair Mountain, these federal aircraft are actually used for surveillance. Billy was not happy about this, but there was not much that he could do at the time. Now, I can only imagine Don Chafin would have loved to have had these U.S. bombers and fighters on his team, but General Bandholtz takes away that option and ends up using them for surveillance only. Still, the seed is planted, and Don decides to try to do some of his own bombing. He hires 3 biplanes, which not as great as the Air Service, right? Especially not in the numbers. And then he's going to have them throw out bombs instead. It's not going to be the same, right? It's not going to be the same kinds of bombs, the same kinds of armaments. In fact, it's pretty limited. Historical evidence shows that there were 4 bombs that were created. 2 were some kind of homemade bomb, and 2 were a gas bomb, which I'm curious if that's something that might have been military surplus or somehow obtained that way. That would be a great thing for future historians to explore. They end up bombing minor positions. And this is historic because there's really nothing else comparable to this where Americans are bombing other Americans. In fact, it's a very, very famous moment in this battle. But it doesn't have the same effect that it would have been if the U.S. bombers had been doing it. The bombs are largely duds. One of them does not explode and ends up being used in the court cases later on. But one thing that does happen is that the miners begin to think, especially with consideration of General Bandholtz mentioning treason charges and so forth in the past, that the U.S. Army, which is where the Air Service is located, as I recall, is actually involved in bombing them. And I think this kind of starts to set the stage for what's going to happen on Day 3. Day 3 is the bloodiest day of the Battle of Blair Mountain, and it's also the final day. Here we see Bill Blizzard sending 3,000 Union miners up Blair Mountain to push Don Chafin out. We have to remember, Don Chafin's army is entrenched, and they have the resources and the guns to probably outlast anything that the Union miners can do in this kind of fight. In fact, we see 2 fierce waves of battle happening as the miners attempt to push up to the ridge and are eventually pushed back. they're unable to take Blair Mountain. At this point, General Banholtz also becomes utterly frustrated with the situation and decides he's going to take things over. He sends federal troops to both sides with the purpose of disarming them. Now, this is a very effective thing against the miners. We have to remember that the miners often were former soldiers, and they utterly balked at the idea of fighting against federal troops. They were fine with attacking Don Chafin's army, but the idea of fighting against their own was not something that they were willing to do. In the end, both sides are disarmed. Both sides agree to a ceasefire, and the miners begin disarming and drifting away from Blair Mountain. We'll never know the butcher's bill for the Battle of Blair Mountain, but based on historical record, we do expect that fatalities were somewhere in the range of 100 to 150. What we do know clearer is that 985 miners were indicted for murder and treason. I think everyone's greatest concern in the Union was that the Union leadership, Bill Blizzard included, would be charged with treason and murder in Logan County. That means that he would have been under Don Chafin's control. This is a difficult situation, and most likely Bill Blizzard and others' own attorneys actually charged them with crimes in nearby Kanawha County. This was strategic because it puts them in custody, but it also keeps them in custody in a safer place. Instead, the leaders declined. They actually agreed to be surrendered to Don Chafin and moved to Logan County. And I think they fully expected death. In the end, Don agrees to have the cases moved elsewhere. The trials are moved to Jefferson County, West Virginia. And this is a great example of early social media because here, almost immediately, we begin to see people smearing both sides of the equation. People coming through town and talking about one thing, but then only to bring up the bloody Union strike and how horrible they were, or how horrible Don Chafin had been in the region. It's interesting because both sides end up being polluted for a legal case. In the scheme of things, Blizzard ends up being found not guilty of treason through a series of cases, actually. The miners experience several other lesser charges. Other cases are moved to other places, and things gradually decline. But I think what was most notable was not the immediate impacts on the people that fought there, but the impacts on the Union as a whole. In the days after the Battle of Blair Mountain, we begin to see the impacts on the Union develop. Membership begins to drop from 50,000 to 10,000. We also see, too, that the leaders involved, Bill Blizzard, Keeney, Mooney, all were stripped of power, although some eventually would come back into lower positions. Nonetheless, we see that the Yellow Dog contract really begins to wreak havoc. Its legal support that it could legally bind people from unionizing and being part of a union really begins to take over the area. In fact, it makes unions largely irrelevant in West Virginia until the 1930s. Meanwhile, Don Chafin had proved everything he probably could have ever hoped here. He had proven that his power was absolute. He controlled Logan County. In fact, some argue that he became drunk on that power, and that would end up being his downfall. He wouldn't be in power in Logan County for too many more years until a moonshine case involving the Hatfield family, interestingly enough, would slowly but surely strip him from power. Still, Blair Mountain was a symbolic event. Even today, the idea of the Battle of Blair Mountain remains a strategic, symbolic rallying point for Union workers around the United States. It hasn't been forgotten. There's one more postscript to this battle that I want to mention, and that's for the battlefield itself. After the battle occurs, spent cartridges, lost guns, and items littered the ground, and gradually nature took those back. They were covered with leaf debris and so forth with time, and were just part of the area. Archaeologists in the 2000s began to kind of take an interest in this, particularly hobby archaeologists in the area, and they began to document a lot of the history as well as doing professional archaeological digs to document what had happened and explore the area. They began finding many of the guns that had been hidden during the disarmament process for both sides. But they realized the importance of this area, and they asked that it become a National Historic Register location. And it was added in 2009. One of the complications to this, however, was that the mineral rights existed to this property. In fact, they were held by Arch Coal and Massey Energy at the time, and they both proposed that they would like to do mountaintop removal at this location. Now, time out for a moment. Imagine that you're a coal company today and you are able to symbolically destroy this massive historical site for Union history. I think that there would be some extreme value to that from their perspective. Going back into the story, a long series of events happened where the state of West Virginia noted that there were clerical errors in the application that made it illegitimate. It went to the federal courts, the appellates. It ends up being a situation that's constantly been flipped-flopped. And finally, at some point in 2018, the Keeper's Office, which is overseeing all of these records, says that actually there weren't errors and that the standing is legitimate. At this time, Blair Mountain sits as a National Historic Register site, but we don't know what the future holds. It is something, though, that while it exists, I encourage you to visit. I encourage you to swing by to try to understand what that history would have been like. Likewise, for those who aren't able to visit, there's tons of videos on YouTube of people visiting the area, including some of those archaeologists that were so interested in the area and helped to get it listed on the National Register. So there we have it, the Battle of Blair Mountain, the end of the West Virginia Mine Wars, the largest armed insurrection on U.S. soil since the Civil War. You probably figured out by now that I love history, and I'm watching the views on these last couple of history videos, and you seem to like watching them. So this looks like a deal. Maybe you like and subscribe to the channel. Maybe I'll make some more. If there's a particular history series or event you'd like me to cover, leave a note below. If it's in my area, I'll see what I can do. I'll also be thinking about some other future history videos from my work that I might want to do in the future. I'm actually thinking of a couple more mining videos if you're interested. All right, that's enough for now. I'll see you later. Take care.